is a lecturer in liberal arts and visual cultures education at King's College London and author of The Computer Animated Film, available in all good bookshops. And I, Alex that is, am a senior lecturer in film and media studies at the University of Portsmouth and author of Encountering the Impossible, the fantastic in Hollywood fantasy cinema, available in even better bookshops. We do this podcast to provide audiences with an informative and hopefully entertaining guide through the ways in which you can not only enjoy fantasy and animation, but study it, examine it, explore it, and of course, make it and have a career in it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Today, Chris, we are covering something slightly different than usual, a documentary. It is not necessarily an animated documentary, but it does have drawings and animations in it. Yeah. Is that I've already fired the first shot, have I? Okay. But an interesting documentary that certainly, as you would say, is certainly about animation.
That was my opening gambit. We're actually doing there's an ongoing gag on the podcast where it's like, is this film really about animation? As it kind of reflect. That was it is fine. We've landed. We've done it.
On a film that is about animation. Yeah. So this is Life Animated, the 2016 American documentary by Roger Ross Williams, which covers the life of Owen Suskind, an autistic man who has a relationship with the Disney Studios back catalogue that the film explores and identifies as a key source of pedagogy, a key source of kind of self-expression within his sort of life and journey up until this point. So I think there's lots of things that I've got to say about fantasy, mythology. There's lots of things in the film about constructing mythology out of these kind of popular texts that struck my eye as someone interested in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I actually don't really know where to start because there's so much that one could say about the idea of Disney classics. I think the film is about it's lucky that he's not watching Rescuers Down Under, he's watching the classics, and I thought so there's something around kind of the image of Disney and stuff, but also obviously animation in terms of reenactment. There's a line about animation being used to make sense of the world, which is kind of a common refrain I think with regards to animated documentary, and stuff on kind of voice work and puppetry, which the film kind of dramatizes in terms of this is how you construct an animated performance. So yeah, I sort of may touch on all of those or none of those.
That might be the only time you mention it.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Well, luckily we are joined by a very special guest who's going to help us through the murky world of the movie and work out sort of what it's saying, if it's even saying anything. We are delighted to be joined by Janet Harbord, who's Professor of Film Studies at Queen Mary University. Janet's work explores the many ways in which the film itself creates relationships between bodies, feelings and environments. She's the author of countless wonderful texts on this, including Film Cultures, The Evolution of Film and Eccentric Cinema. And for the last 5 years, which might be of interest to our discussion today, Janet's been the lead investigator on a project called Autism Through Cinema, which explores the relationship between medical film and entertainment film in key moments throughout the 20th century and examining how certain bodies are made legible and others illegible through the kind of creative process and practice. Janet's a member of the Centre for Film and Ethics at Queen Mary and has also just made a film about this subject called Autism Plays Itself, which we're going to hear more about later in the show. So Janet, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, first of all.
Hi, thanks for that great introduction. Yeah, so I've just come to the end of the project that's about cinema and autism, funded by Wellcome, and that I've co-run with my colleague here, the filmmaker Stephen Eastwood. And it's a project that's been about exploring autism not through representation, through its sort of the typical way in which we tend to approach disability and otherness, but exploring what it is about cinema that shares an affinity with an autistic sensibility. So we've been working with lots of different groups, Project Artworks in Hastings, different associations, community groups. to kind of co-create an idea of cinema between academics, between autistic practitioners and artists. That's produced some co-written articles, films, and so on. So we didn't want to come to cinema thinking about what's the truth about autism. And Stuart Murray, who writes a lot about autism, he has an autistic son, writes a lot about autism and cinema, and has argued, I think quite convincingly, that autism is seen as a kind of a problem to be solved or a condition to be understood through cinema. And we've really come at it the other way around to think about how has neurotypicality kind of framed our idea of cinema and limited it, and how might we trace an autistic sensibility through cinema. So this film today has some interesting points of contact with those sets of debates. And it's a film also that we programmed when we worked with the Barbican. We had a short series of films about autism and cinema a couple of years ago. And this was kind of in the middle of our programme. Perhaps one of our more conservative choices, but we had a lot of debate. That programme generated a lot of debate in media. We were covered by The Independent, The Guardian, sort of trying to engage people in a discussion about what an autistic sensibility is. So I'm kind of approaching this film from that angle.
Okay, yeah, I mean, excellent, and we've picked the film deliberately to kind of explore some of these wider issues. I think it's a film that people might have heard of. It certainly did sort of the rounds a few years ago, and yeah, I think there's lots to unpack within the film. Before we get to it exactly, I guess I'm going to ask a question perhaps on Chris's behalf, which is the role of animation in your kind of engagement with film. I know animation was a key part of the Autism Through Cinema project more broadly. Could you say a little bit more about sort of how animation fits in with those various projects and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the members of the group, Alex Widdowson, is an animator, and he was the PhD student on the project. And he has worked that seam between animated documentary or evocative animated documentary. And he worked with autistic participants and created a sort of feedback loop where he would have conversations that he then drew and then would show these to the participant, and they would work together on what they felt about that animation. And he's made a number of films, a short and a longer version that's still in production. So I think the idea of animation in the project is that it can kind of script anything. Sort of it's the opposite of the indexical image. It's one basic way of thinking about it, that the indexical kind of locks us into something that is a version of the real or a shared reality, whereas what we were trying to explore in the project was something that wasn't a shared reality, that might actually be more singular in its form.
So I mean, not to get too kind of simplistic in drawing some of the threads out of that, but it sounds like there's something about animation's ability to represent the subjective, or even maybe just to dislocate the objective might be the way of thinking about it. We think of cinema, right, as this, as you say, indexical, photographic. What's the redemption of objective reality is the famous Bazin quote, right? I can see that having a lot of charged words if you're talking about issues of neurodiversity and neurotypicality, as in, what is this objective world we're all living? What does it look like? And I guess key, what does it sound and feel like, right? Which is kind of a lot of what this film's engaging with, and I suspect what you've been talking about. So is it that makes animation an interesting vehicle to explore, that it kind of it isn't starting from that assumption that we've kind of embedded into the kind of more photographic origins of cinema?
Yeah, I think that's a really major part of what we were doing. I like that idea of dislocation from an idea of shared reality. Yes, it was that, but I think that animation has also been important in the project for bringing together a kind of sensory apprehension of the world. So it's not as though it's trying to be in the shoes of someone who is autistic. And I think that's where Life Animated, for me, kind of falls down a bit, that there are those moments that actually kind of shoehorn Owen into a particular position, like as a child, as a typical child watching Disney. Oh, look what happens to him. It all goes wrong. And that's the autistic kind of moment that everyone's trying to work with for the rest of the film. But I think animation, in the way that Alex was using it on our project, was to kind of engage with cinema's many capacities to make the audience feel different things, not necessarily in an autistic way, but just to make us aware of the way that neurotypicality limits where we look on the screen, for example.
So to bring this into our film of the day, it sounds like there are two ways that animation functions in this film, and actually we've hit on perhaps the less obvious one in the film itself, because it's certainly in terms of screen time, it's the one that takes up most time, which is this idea. So this is a film that sort of, what is it? It's telling us the story of Owen now. So it's sort of about him moving out of his parents' house and getting a flat for himself, and there are breakups and all the sort of things that 23-year-olds go through, whilst interspersed with the kind of story of his life up until this point. And the story of his life is very much told through this prism of his relationship to Disney movies.
Yep.
But to represent, so we'll get to the Disney Dumbo elephant in the room, I guess, in a minute. But it sounds like where we are at the moment is to talk about the way in which his early life is represented in the film, which is largely through drawings and kind of limited animation, if I'm using that term roughly.
Sort of. There are two. One of the things that I was thinking of was, okay, how is animation being used in the film in those two ways? So one is, of course, interspersing lines of dialogue with the interviews and the kind of testimonies with footage from Disney films in a way that I don't necessarily think he's watching that film at that time. They are making that. They're making that kind of connection. Okay, so there's the use of sort of the Disney classics, let's say, and then there is the sort of the animated film that is made seemingly alongside it, that is interspersed at various moments, that are supposed to more directly. Well, perhaps they serve the same role actually as the animated the Disney sequences, trying to sort of visualize in ways that are very familiar, I think, from the register of animated documentary, being using animation in terms of solving a problem by evoking his particular experiences of what he's saying and sort of trying to, and also not only what he's saying, it's often done through the father. The father's stories are often animated, and that I found interesting. It's not just we're going to animate Owen's experiences and sort of make that connection. I thought it was interesting that they're now just animating to any story that's being told about Owen. So I thought that was interesting, the way that these little short films, these little short sequences are being used to sort of, they're supposed to do what the home videos do at the same time.
Sure. So Janet, could you mentioned that you have some issues with this movie in some ways. I have some issues with this movie in some ways. So let's talk through some of our issues.
This is your favourite bit now, isn't it?
When we talk about our issues. So those sequences, how do they strike you from someone that's worked with and with people trying to kind of do something at least comparable to that kind of exercise of representing experience through animation?
Yeah, well, I think that there's a logic to this, that it's a kind of mainstream documentary that sets out to provide a story of a family with an autistic son, and it kind of it's a triumph over adversity narrative to a certain extent, with Disney at the centre. And so I think it's part of its kind of marketing populist appeal. This is how they got funding, and the type of Disney that they pick up on, as you're saying, it's classic Disney. It's got a very wide reach in terms of audience knowledge of those stories, right? And some of them exist in book forms and all sorts of other things.
I was being cynical, but there is a sort of fine. but exactly as you're saying, that there's a certain type of Disney being used as a reference point.
And possibly even the Disney that was, associated with the parents' childhood or their experience of Disney. So there's something that maybe it's being passed on.
I'm almost certain a lot of those were not available on a home video to watch, because Disney very famously keeps some back, so you can't buy a lot of these things on. So I was like, I don't think he's watching these. I don't think they're the ones he's watching because they're not available. Anyway.
He was watching on VHS though. We see VHS a lot, so which I quite appreciated.
I have things to say about VHS, but we'll
we'll come to that.
There's so many places to start in this one. This is why. Sorry.
But I would just going back to that moment of the film's early construction of his life as a child, where you get Disney's brought in to kind of fill in the emotional emotional backstory for what's happening for the parents and for him. And then we get the kind of real time, but we also get the story told in amateur footage that the parents have taken. So that's a kind of third spoke in this, where there's a different form of authenticity that is from the parents' point of view. I think that there's something a bit problematic about point of view in this film, and the animation is blurred with that. And I think thinking about whose desire for Disney, whose Disney it is, whether it's the parents or Owen's, and again, whose point of view it is when we're seeing the home footage. Of course, it's the parents. And I think Owen is very much at the centre of this film, but through other people's eyes, including through the animation. So I think he creates or crafts his own language by adopting Disney formats, but I think there's a really strong sense in the film of the parents' oversight of all of this. It's sort of like the parents' view of Owen rather than Owen's view of Owen, and that doesn't really shift for me through the film.
Yeah. I had a question based on the sort of when something like Waltz with Bashir is entirely animated and then has the live action sequence or the little shot at the end, and we had this conversation when we did Waltz with Bashir. But when a film uses that sort of home video footage, that amateur footage, alongside these animated, going back on what I said earlier, are we supposed to read them, or do you think the film is asking us to read them as equally as realistic and authentic, or are they trying to make a claim that actually perverse animation is the more authentic because of that freedom and that flexibility and that versatility? Or is it saying that this is what the home video, it's making a distinction between the two, that the home video footage is serving this kind of role with the voiceover playing over and them talking about the sword fight and all this sort of stuff, versus the animation, which is, okay, we know it's not real, but it's still, we know it's not real or photographic, but it's no more or no less authentic. So I just wondered, given that there are three, as you say, those three, there's the testimony and the sort of the live what's happening now in 2016 or whatever. Yes. There's the amateur footage, the home video footage, and the animation. I just wonder what. And
then there's the animation that they've done to represent Owen's life through the parents' eyes, as you say. And then there's the intercepts of Disney animation. Just
so how are we supposed to take that collage of different mixed media, basically? I just wondered if you had any, because I don't know how to take it, and I don't know what the film is saying about the registers of authenticity.
Yeah, I think that the animation that they make of Owen is, I think it does operate as a kind of authentic text in that collage, as you nicely name it, in that he. In those moments we get his flights of fantasy, but they're mostly about feeling. And I think given the framework in which autism is positioned as a condition in which people don't express feelings, that there's sort of social communication difficulty, that appears in the film as the inside story. This is Owen's subjectivity, and we get to it in this way, and it's appropriate to animate it because that's where all of his feelings are registered or lie. So I think there's something about that. But I think it's also telling that even though Owen grows up in the course of the film, he's still animated as a child, and that's kind of where the problem is. I think that in this space, I think Owen is particularly credited with childish feelings in a way. We all could be, right? We all draw on our childhoods as these formats, these schemas where we learn how to relate to people and what frightens us, and these things are kind of lodged in our psyches, in our bodies. But I think in this film it kind of tends to give the sense that Owen never grows up, and that's very much the dialogue around him leaving home. Will he be all right? Is he going to grow up? He has those conversations with his brother about sex and so on, and then his brother reveals that he's quite anxious about the responsibility of Owen as when his
parents go.
Exactly, all of that. So Owen becomes a sort of a problem child in his adulthood, I think, and that the animations support that reading. Yeah,
well, I suppose the not growing up. This is where I was most cynical. And I was thinking about how the film is using, because the first film that he watches, you see posters of Hunchback of Notre Dame, you see Aladdin, but the first film he watches is Peter Pan.
Yeah.
That's the first VHS that he's sitting and watching, and I was thinking, okay, so we're seeing the footage. Is this what Owen is watching, or is this meaning being created? Because you also have shots of the television, so he is watching something, but there was an element of calculation where I thought, the Disney films are being used quite usefully, actually.
I have two things to say about that. Now we're getting cynical.
Yeah.
The first is that
look at his face.
That Peter Pan bit's really interesting because it may. This is perhaps a thing we can talk about in a bit about the kind of the use of the Disney canon or the attempt to canonize it. In that sense, in that, it's of course he's watching the bit where they're in the nursery. He's not watching the racially problematic bit where they spend 20 minutes pretending to be Indigenous Americans, because that bit wouldn't really work very well, would it? So it's about how Owen is perceived to use the Disney movies, and it's rarely when they're at their most abrasively problematic. It's usually when they're at their most cuddly. Which I think is interesting to talk about. And the second thing is actually I'm not quite sure that's right in terms of that's not the first film we see him watching. The first film I've got, very right at the beginning, you see a very early shot of him as a small baby pressing his hand up against Fantasia.
Right.
And I thought that's very interesting because that first shot seems to be making a claim that this small infant is excited by the colours, the drawings, the animatedness of the films. And of course you use Fantasia to do that because it's the film where I don't think a 12-year-old sits through Fantasia, but a child might because they're not watching it for narrative. Yeah. But by the time we get to Peter Pan, he's starting to mythologise. So the use function of the Disney movies actually shifts by, and they're not quite sure what that link is. Is it that there's something about the drawn nature of it, the animated nature of it, the colorized worlds that he is using as part, or is it something broader about kind of Disney mythology and things like that? I guess it can be both, but I'm interested in that shift in register.
No, you're right. Actually, above I've got a brief shot of him as a child watching Fantasia. I was thinking about Persona, the child in Persona. I was like, oh, this is Persona.
Perhaps healthier, but fine.
Sure. I don't know. I mean. I don't know. I think the animatedness is interesting, like the use of Fantasia, certainly.
Do you have any thoughts earlier that?
I think the reference to Fantasia earlier on is anchoring the film very kind of neatly in the history of a particular form of animation that runs through an American studio that's very dominant through the 20th century into today. So for me, that was that. It's in a particular tradition. It's saying something about mainstream animation, and all of the conventions, the problematic conventions that go with that, as you say. I mean, another problematic convention is gender in these animations, and that follows through also in some of the comments that the brother makes about being a red-blooded American man,
sure.
And when his brother isn't showing the same sexual aptitude for sex in the same way. There are sort of things like that that resonate between the animation and the real world the documentary conversations that aren't really. Well, that aren't picked up at all. Yeah,
but that's where the film, when it brings it back to him, I think the closest film that he gets connected to is Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is one of my favourites, but it uses it in a very particular way. One, because the ending of the film is not the happy ending. Quasimodo actually brings together Phoebus and Esmeralda, so he's the mediator between the romantic couple, of which he has no part. But the film then uses a lot of, in terms of like the notion of a freak, the film draws from those sequences of Hunchback of Notre Dame and tries to align Quasimodo with Owen and sort of says this is. I don't know. There's also something, the sidekick element of all of this is particularly interesting because the sidekicks, there's scholarship written on specifically the sidekicks. There's an article by Lynn Lonrot, who is an article called I Don't Have Skull or Bones, Minor Characters in Disney Animation. And she argues that minor characters or sidekicks are always much more interesting. Mm-hmm. Like they're always doing something. That's where the plasmaticness of the body never went away because it's all the sidekick operates according to a different set of laws and a different set of rules. And bodies do different things and stuff like that. So I can see what the film is doing, and I definitely didn't want to be so cynical with regards to the way it uses Disney, but it is interesting the accents that are placed on certain scenes and certain sequences to give a sense of Owen's experience through that animation, but also how that animation somehow reflects perfectly what he's feeling at that time, and that was the bit of the jarring that I don't know.
Yeah, I think your point about the sidekicks is really interesting, and that it's the part of the film that I think is the richest when we see him drawing.
Yeah.
When we see that he's gone, we hear from his father that he's disappeared downstairs, and when the father finds all these drawings, it's a really nice moment that here he is, he's having his own engagement. He's identified himself in this range of different characters across films who are the sidekicks. And I think they are fantastic characters. There's a really nice essay by Giorgio Agamben called "The Assistants" that picks up on these characters, and he mentions Kafka's assistants. There's a range of literary assistants that he draws on here as well. As they're characters that have a lot of gradation in terms of their kind of their morality and so on. They're quite often lazy, but they're also witty and they're clever, and they're good at kind of being in the moment. And I think there's something that's really powerful about Owen's identification with these characters, where he's realizing as well that he's not a hero in terms of a kind of neurotypical figuration of a cast. So he positions himself somewhere else through these characters. And I was hoping that when I first saw this film, that the film would go somewhere else with that, and we might actually get Owen's version of animation. We might see what he animates rather than these versions of him as a child that we keep getting. And there is something listed as a film by him that's released in the same year.
Yeah.
I've never seen it. I don't know where it is, but I'd be interested in that if it does exist as a short text of his animations.
Yeah, unsurprising as the podcast's fantasist, like that's the bit that kind of struck me as well. This kind of quite complicated, nuanced mythology that he'd sort of built up through these drawings, and there's this line, he sees himself as the protector of the sidekick.
Yeah,
I thought was really interesting because, well, and it doesn't really explore exactly the kind of the depths of this mythology, but the question it makes me ask is, okay, who is he protecting them from? And what's his role as protector? And because the other thing about sidekicks is that, and I think this is where I suspect a slightly more knotty relationship and more human relationship reveals, is that there's a lot of anger and a lot of potential anger and resentment about identifying yourself with a sidekick in these movies, because what you're recognizing as well is that these movies aren't for you in a way. He's having to find himself in these movies rather than being for him, despite he's obviously seen them lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of times. And this idea that the value of the sidekick only really matters in the story in terms of their use value to the main protagonists.
Yeah.
So in many ways, he is kind of positioned as sidekick in this movie, in that he is often seen through the perspective and the use value of those around him who are in more positions of power, through whether it's a parental figure or the kind of the healthcare workers that work with him or whatever it is. I think there's more to. I don't know. Obviously, I don't know any more about that relationship, but I'd like to have seen more of that, because I suspect there's a less cosy but very helpful way of thinking through some of these issues that the film doesn't seem really that interested in exploring.
No, I think it likes to keep the accessible parts of autism, or making autism sort of accessible, what I would say is legible to an audience. So
Yes.
we get him framed through lines, through scenes that will explain something about autism. And Stuart Murray would say, well, that's absolutely what the majority of autism films are about, are explaining the main character's feelings about looking after an autistic child, and that's what we get here. Right? We get the parents' disappointment at the beginning. It's a tragedy. It's a terrible version of autism we get in the early part of it, and I can't help wondering what Owen might think in watching this. Right? How does he experience his parents' sense of autism as a tragedy, for example?
There's lots of lines about Owen vanishing,
Yes.
and he's still in there,
Yes.
as if there's this sort of
Locked
foreign
in.
invasion taking place to the son. Well, in a way, they are describing that, right? There's a vision of their son that they feel they still clearly
I think is lost.
Yeah. And that what they've got is a kind of partial. I'm trying to frame their language really, but that sort of partial restoration of their son through his relationship to these movies. But you're right. That struck me as a problematic way of phrasing this.
Yeah. So it's like autism is an imposter. It's like a bad character in one of these films that's come and taken their son, and there's that sort of plays along, and the parents gradually acclimatise themselves to that by themselves using Disney language as a means to get to their lost son who's been captured. So there's a whole thing. The whole autism story has been Disneyfied, if you like, in terms of the parental view of loss and binary figurations. Like, there's nothing about autism that seems particularly valuable in this film. That's the discussion of echolalia, for example. You know, when they go quite early, they take their son to an educational psychologist who says actually echolalia is just it's an echoing, it's a very typical thing that autistic children do. He's not communicating with you, he's just repeating things. But actually, you know, when you read a scholar like Rem Yergo, whose book Authoring Autism talks about echolalia through their own experience as an autistic child of using lines from films in lots of different ways. Like, they used the script of Airplane. It would come out frequently in different moments, meaning, you know, sometimes in the supermarket it was about being overwhelmed, sometimes it was about being fearful or excluded, all sorts of different ways in which that's actually quite a flexible thing to be doing from an autistic perspective. But here we get it like, you know, it's either communication or it's not, you know. It's one or the other according to the psychologist and to the parent. So there's something that seems like really quite old-fashioned about the film's take on autism. And I think it's to do with the fact that Owen isn't given a voice in it, really.
Just based on your I don't think I've written as many notes about any film as I have this one. So there's so much to say, and I'm so pleased we've got you to help say. The point you made about animation as an imposter, I thought was interesting, because the thing that really struck me about the film is the performance. Like, there's lots of scenes where obviously Owen is performing, and then the parents, obviously that's the key moment of the film, where the father performs as Iago through the kind of hand puppet. And sort of, I was thinking about animation's relationship to puppetry and stuff, which we've talked about previously and stuff. And then there's a sort of kind of great sequence where you have the original voice actors from Aladdin come in and do a couple of scenes and stuff like that. And so there's a register of animation and performance that is interesting in relation, and also being able to do the voices, and that's a kind of common that seems to be part of what they're doing, is how accurately can I get the voices, these canonical voices. I'm just wondering that if animation, this sort of autism, being an imposter, that somehow it's not valuable, or it's not. There's an emptiness, as you say, like Owen is still in there somewhere. There's a language around the way that autism is framed. I just wonder whether or not rather than celebrate animation, does the film end up having an inverse thing, which is like, well, this is just like putting on voices and just like drawings and I'm trying to. That's an element that I was trying to get is it really celebrating the capacity of animation to unlock Owen, or is it just saying animation is sort of like what you were saying about the repetition of all it is just repeating. There's an artificiality that's, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I don't necessarily think it's not the discourse on animation in the film is not entirely celebratory, even though we can talk about how it renders all these subjective experiences, and that was how he was unlocked as a human. Actually, it ends up, the outcome of some of these things is not entirely positive. I think that animation is being used as a sort of, I don't know, there's a kind of frenzy to it.
Well, there's that, back to the point you referenced about the brother's testimony about worrying about Owen's sexuality and how to talk to him about sex and all this sort of stuff. And he makes the point that I don't know how to do that because there's no sex in Disney movies. Maybe I'll have to show him some Disney porn or something.
Yeah.
And so it's the idea, I guess, that I think the film certainly wants to make the claim that Disney animation,
in particular,
not just animation, Disney animation,
and also these 8 films,
these 8 films, has helped in. He's using quotation marks again, everybody. Unlock,
as
Owen.
they're saying,
but there is a lamentation or tragedy to that the film can't help engage with, because unlocking a person through Disney creates a Disneyfied human.
Yeah,
and so what we have is a human that you don't know. Well, the way the film presents, I'm talking about. Obviously, I don't know the real Owen is like. But the way the film presents him is this kind of Disneyfied human who is unable to access, even if he wanted to, certain aspects of life because it doesn't appear in a Disney movie. And I think the film is willing to at least pose that as a kind of tragic end note, because it's not completely celebratory, but I don't think it's willing to interrogate that entirely. You're nodding, Joe.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that the film often seems to move in one direction and then ends up kind of doing a U-turn with it. And I think the approach to animation is like that. Like when you come to this film, Life Animated, it's a great title, and it has lots of promise, I think, for thinking about autism. And it speaks also to, the stereotype around autistic people not having imagination, being monotropic, being very focused on one thing that is quite factual, your kind of Rain Man type typical character. And here you have, full engagement of a man with animation, with Disney. It suggests that it's going to take that stereotype somewhere else and show us something much more flexible and nuanced. But in fact, it drives us straight into very scripted scenes of a limited range from a very small group of films. So it sort of delivers the opposite.
So I'm interested in whether I think this is a imposition by the family, as in, is this a consequence of, he loves Disney, let's, because of course children love Disney, give him Disney, or whether this is something about the production itself, because obviously there's a I don't know the production history of this movie. I don't know if anyone, if we do here, but I know there's obviously some sort of discussion with the Disney studio about the use of the clips, the use of things. They even draw sort of new versions of the characters, don't they, in these original drawings?
Yep.
All this sort of stuff appears. So there's got to have been some sort of discussion behind the scenes. There's one bit of the film that absolutely fascinated me, and it's just a small shot, and it's when he's unpacking his VHS. He's moved into the new apartment. And the first thing he does is he unpacks his VHS. And as I say, I wanted to say stuff about VHS because there's obviously something about ownership of VH. It's not just about watching the movie, it's about owning the movies.
Media,
like Maybe think of sort of Barbara Klinger's work on kind of DVD possession and
absolutely.
And the VHSs as well, they have to be VHSs.
Yeah, they can't be DVDs. The film wouldn't work if it's DVD. It has to be
big kind of American style boxes of it that are like the size of my front room.
It's just analog. VHS is grainy and old and well worn. It's Wally.
But there's a shot of him putting the films out, and it lasts 2 seconds. But there's a Disney movie, there's Shrek, and there's Matilda.
I spotted
and
it.
I was like, hang on. So it's not just Disney movies. No. It's one, it's DreamWorks as well, and two, it's children's movies. It's obviously positioning that again. I don't know what his other DVD rack. Maybe he's got Die Hard on the other rack. Wouldn't surprise me, But
he's got Die Hard with a Vengeance because that's great.
Anyway, but that really kind of shot up a series of questions because it's so is the canonisation going on in the production here? Is this child actually not... Sorry, he's not a child. I've fallen into the film's trap there. This 23-year-old man, is he watching actually lots of different movies? One of them, is he a movie fan? Or is he a Disney fan? Because Shrek, the brother wants to talk to him about more spiky things. Shrek starts to get us there. Matilda, interesting, a story of a child who's different, who's ostracised by their parents.
Yes.
Interesting he would identify with that. Reading a lot into all of this, but... I don't know. It threw up the possibility that this is not someone who is obsessed with Disney so much as obsessed with cinema.
Or even animation, not Disney or animation.
But Matilda isn't even animated.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I don't know. Thoughts?
I mean, just a bit of the production history is that the film is based on a book that the father wrote.
Right,
He's a journalist, so Ron Suskind.
And the producer of...
Don't Look Up, apparently.
Right, yes.
Just to clarify that.
So there are lots of connections in media, and presumably that's partly how the film got made, because it's someone with the capacity to organise in that way. But I think there's also a story that's about how the film was made and then shown to Disney Studio, and Disney, they all kind of got watery eyes like the mother does constantly through the film, and said, yes, we'll grant the rights for you to use extracts from the films. So you might be onto something in thinking that Disney might have asserted a particular version of animation history.
Doesn't sound like Disney.
It doesn't. Or one sells the movie in the way that one wants to sell it if one knows that what needs to be done to get permission.
Yes, absolutely.
Right,
Yeah.
It reminds me, I think Disney have a history, and we can be as cynical as you want about it. I don't really,
awesome.
In my imagination, I don't really believe in misty-eyed Disney executives, unfortunately. But hey, there's nuance where they could be both making sound commercial decisions and getting misty-eyed about it.
Yeah.
But it reminds me of things like there's in the middle of Great Ormond Street, there's a Disney coral reef playground, and it's made by. It's all the licensed Disney characters. There's the Little Mermaid in there. There's lots of there's probably lots of examples around the world. But Disney like to be the solution to childhood sickness, for want of a better word, however we define that culturally or physically or whatever. And I think there's something in that it would be a more complicated narrative for the Disney studio if Disney was one of many different movies of which this works with. And it's interesting that the parents, at least in this film, only talk about his relationship to Disney.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it sort of it polarizes, doesn't it? That sense of life into, well, here's the harsh reality of sickness, or if you perceive autism to be a condition that doesn't have that's deficit, here's Disney that kind of supplements life with something that is that's pleasurable and outside of those limitations.
Well, and certainly, yeah. How far do I want to go with this? But I certainly think. I guess it raises that question you raised at the beginning, Janet. Is Owen interested in Disney because he's genuinely interested in Disney, or if the parents gave him lots of Disney movies from a childhood, and those are the movies he's consumed and found a relationship with? I guess this is true of all our childhood obsessions and things like that. Where, no matter who you are, to an extent, you are given the things by your parents that they think you will get something out of based on their associations with that, rather than the things that you can genuinely find a meaning for. But usually what happens in childhood, if that happens, is that you find your kind of own punky edges to that.
I think hopefully you do. And I think we do see Owen at times with engaging with the films. And we were just talking about the VHS moments where we actually see him watching stuff quite early on. I love that scrolling that he does with the remote, that he just scrubs through the VHS in a way that it's very different from the look of scrubbing through a DVD or streaming.
Yeah, so actually, why are we saying DVD? Like, that's the thing everyone's doing these days.
That was the MP4s now. Yeah. So, but it has that feeling that he knows exactly where he wants to get to, and it's very physical. He's sort of thumb on the remote in that way, and he scrubs through, gets to the scene, watches that, runs with it, then moves on to the next one. There's something about that physicality that also gets lost in the film. It gets to be about the content of the line and the emotional connection, because that's the language that the parents found of connecting with him. But actually there's his connection with the films that is much more about repetition and soothing and pleasure and something else.
Oh yeah. I didn't mean to say he obviously has some relationship with these movies, but I just wonder if it's a little bit messier than the film
for sure
presents.
Yeah.
I'm sure it must be, right? Yeah.
I was trying to think of kind of scholarship on not to ruin the experience of watching the film, but I like on cinephilia, because he got at points he goes for a job interview at a cinema or ends up working at the cinema. We get to do our Bond reference because there's a poster of Spectre in the cinema.
Is that okay? Good, very good, very good. Tick that off the list. If
only they were showing an anniversary screening of The Wizard of Oz, would be great. His cinephilic sort of tendencies, his status as collector, as kind of media archivist, as fan as well. The fact he sets up this Disney film club and there's sort of a fan community. So there's that feeds into everything. But kind of scholarship on cinephilia and the particular sort of Thomas L. Sass will say kind of the videophilia of kind of collecting and pausing and rewinding, and the pleasure in that grainy image and the well-worn VHS, that it makes perfect sense that the film, he may have a DVD collection, but that doesn't, again, it's difficult to be, I'm sorry for being cynical, maybe Disney just invites the question of cynicism, but there's a sort of, the VHS is really important to how the kind of contrast between the grainy film, the grainy home videos, the grainy Disney videos, and then the kind of talking head testimonies now of the brother and the parents and all that sort of stuff. And then the footage at the very, very end where he's giving that talk about autism and stuff, and which includes my favourite moment, because he gives the talk and then he does something that I wish we should all do at the end of conference papers. He just goes like that, hands in the air, and I was like, that's really great. That's how we should end our papers or our lectures. Thanks, everyone. But Disney and I don't know, the kind of cinephilic culture around Disney, and I mentioned it earlier, I mean, this isn't cynical, but Disney has a very particular relationship to home videos and keeping things in their kind of vault, this mysterious place, and then they release these anniversary features at particular times, and makes Disney films very difficult. So he's got this perfect archive of Disney features that he can kind of work with. So the film is saying something, I think, whether it's positive or no, but it's, you know, the pleasure in consuming and physical media, and of course big debates around Disney Plus at the moment and the removal of material from these platforms. So actually having this arc, and that's actually one of the first things when he moves into his new place, there is a real close-up of him aligning up all of his VHSs, as you said. It's not about kind of unpacking all the, it's this is where the home video is going to go, and this is the sort of media setup. So I quite like that element of the film.
I'm glad you mentioned the Disney Club.
Yes,
because I would love to have seen more of that. Because at first I thought, oh wow, that's you know, a lot of what I wrestle with when we do we write about popular media, right? But we are quite cynical about a lot of it. But it's that capacity of, just because of its sheer popularity and pervasiveness, of providing spaces like the Disney Club where people can come together to talk about a shared interest. They can warp is not the right word. They can mold the texts into things that are useful for them, just like Owen does with this kind of, this whole mythology of the sidekicks. And I thought, this looks like a really interesting space that I would like to sit in. The shots you get of it, though, make it seem a bit we get one where he shows them a clip from The Lion King and asks them what the message of the movie is, which is a bit didactic and a bit pedagogic, and I don't know if that's typical or not. And then the other one is where the various cast of Aladdin turn up and do a live performance, which does look fun, but again, I was hoping for somewhere. I was hoping for some drawing, some interactivity, some organic cultural happening in that room, and it never really happens.
No, I mean, and I think that's connected to this idea of repetition and reenactment, and I think that there's, I think, there's a lot of pleasure in remembering, repeating, reenacting films. How many people do you know who know chunks of the script from With Nail and I, or lots of other...
Not me, I haven't seen it, because I've never seen anything.
He's not seen it, but Monty Python.
Monty Python,
in our case, View to a Kill.
Okay, well, I know less well.
Good one, Al.
So, but that, we don't pathologise that. That's taken to be, it's just a thing, right? That people repeat things because it's pleasurable. They're reliving a moment. Every time you repeat it, it's actually different because you're in a different place, perhaps with different people. And I think that moment of that club is part of that. It's about looking at the different moments that are pleasurable, sharing that with other people, getting their takes. And reenactment's quite a sophisticated thing, actually. When we re-perform something, we see the seams of how it's been put together in the first place. So when we get the guy coming in to do the voicing, it's really interesting watching him do the voices of an animated character. We get that collision of his body, his expression when he's doing that, and the voice. So it's actually quite a complex version of repetition that the film begins to get into, and then again, I think it, like you say, it kind of closes that down. But I think that there's an engagement of autism to cinephilia, to reenactment, to forms of a kind of very much about feelings that you have and about films and pleasure taken in them that the film opens up but doesn't kind of pursue enough for me anyway.
No, it's only because those sequences of Iago and Jafar revoicing their characters 20 odd years, whatever, later. 20 odd years later. And then we'll be done with the cynicism. But around 2015, 2016, they've released Zootopia and then Moana. That's when Disney started to produce the videos of like inside the recording booth of like Dwayne The Rock Johnson doing the voices and all the Zootopia people.
Yeah.
And so there's something like that's become a really important pleasure of animated, like the behind the scenes.
Right.
You get it with a lot with stop motion films now, where you have the green screen and the stop motion and the sort of rapid speed of these characters moving, the animators doing all the labour and stuff, and the sort of the rise of these kinds of behind the scenes videos and voice work and recording sessions and how these performances are constructed. That's becoming increasingly important. While voice work, and we've talked about this before in terms of star voices and celebrity voices and stuff, it's definitely become a more prominent element of the selling of these movies, I think. And often they come out not after the films are released, but before the films are released. So you're seeing this footage of them, and then the film will be coming soon. So it's just a really interesting, and this is the same year. This is the same year as Moana 2016. So there's an interesting sort of the way we like seeing how animated performances are constructed. And the film gives us multiple stages. It gives us the initial drawings, it gives us the sort of animators acting out, and then it gives us the real voices and stuff. So it's just a really interesting, it plots a really interesting journey of, you could recut the film and basically it's the making of an animated film.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway.
Isn't it also, is this just when the live action remakes are starting to come upon us?
Well, yes, it's 2 or 3 years before the remake of Aladdin, but
Right.
yes.
Which is featured prominently in the movie.
Oh, it makes it sound. I really enjoyed the film. I really enjoyed the film. I said I've got lots of things, but maybe I enjoyed it because there's lots of things to say about it, and whether those things are then. Yeah, but I also think that Disney, the way that we talk about Disney, the sort of, and I've been thinking about this in terms of the classroom space, teaching with Disney, teaching about Disney, the perils of teaching with Disney, and people have written articles on how they've tried to teach Disney, and the students are often resistant because it's like, you shouldn't overinterpret Disney. Like, Disney's the thing that we can't examine. Disney animation is, it's too popular for us to discuss, and often it takes a bit of time to get over that resistance because students really love it and they've seen it as a child and stuff. And Jason Spurb's written an article about how to teach with Disney. And so I've been interested in the perils of teaching with Disney as a pedagogy. You mentioned pedagogy before, like these are, and also it taps into what the film is saying about the messages that the Disney films communicate, i.e. the role of the happy ending, the formulaic nature to these films, what that then means for somebody who's trying to find their way and sort of become through these films when elements of experience aren't there. The only particular version of human experience is there, versus kind of teaching with Disney, which is a broader question, or kind of teaching about Disney, which is a broader question of should we include Disney in animation syllabi generally because they're so popular. And so thinking about the role of Disney and the usefulness of Disney as a teaching tool, this seemed to speak to me, I think, in interesting ways, because clearly, as you said, like people are getting a lot out of these films. And that's important. Like the pleasure principle is something we shouldn't deny of the film. People are, and I enjoyed watching people get pleasure out of the Disney films. But it's Disney always invites that cynical thread somehow.
It sounds like we're summing up. So I guess my 2 cents on it is that I think it portrays exactly as you're saying this very real and very meaningful and very valuable relationship with media texts. That obviously meant a lot to this family, and means a lot to lots of people around the world. And I think it does do a good job at showcasing the way in which fandom and cinephilia can also make the text far more malleable than kind of quite dull, simplistic readings of the movie might be, right? So we can critique these movies for their heteronormativity, for all the kind of things that we can throw at them, which is fine because they deserve it. But the kind of slightly more interesting thing to do, I always think, is how are they used? And I think Owen is a really good example of someone using Disney and finding things in the Disney that the film perhaps wasn't at the forefront of the filmmaker's mind, but matter and are worth talking about and almost worth articulating because it highlights the way these films actually exist in culture rather than the way these films kind of exist as a kind of stale vacuum. And there's always capacity to read these films subversively, to read these films, to find the things in them that speak to more interesting forms of identity than simply being Aladdin or Jasmine in Aladdin.
Yeah.
My issue with this is I think it positions that relationship as ontological rather than cultural. As in, there's just something about the magic of Disney that makes this available to Owen because it's Disney. And actually, I think it's cultural. I think it's the fact that he's probably given a lot of Disney movies to watch when he was a kid, because that's what we give children to watch when they're children.
Yeah.
A mixture of that and all the other things.
Well, there's loads of Disney merchandise and stuff like that.
The more happenstance nature of these things, I think, could be worth highlighting, which is why I'm obsessed with the Matilda Shrek shot, because that reveals a happenstance that I'd like it to think about more. So I think that's where I am with it. I wish it didn't do that, but I think there are lots of interesting things in it. Janet, do you want to?
Yeah.
Your 2 cents.
Really brought things down. Oh no.
I think it's a very difficult film not to have cynicism about, because
Right, okay.
it is manipulative. I think in terms of the view of, of autism via the parents in terms of a loss. And I think there's. I mean, I would add to what you've just said, Alex, by saying that I think that Owen is a text in this film.
Right.
That he is a text as well as the Disney text, and he becomes a Disney version of autism, if you like. And I think that that's very acceptable and desirable for the parents, that we get Owen within this language that is fine, that is acceptable. We can see in the way that he's drawn that it's a very childlike way of understanding him, and his needs and his desires and his thoughts. And we don't get any of the non-Disney versions of him and of autism more generally, which I think, of course, are like the more interesting parts.
And that would be a perfect point to end it if I weren't a rubbish podcast host. But it just suddenly reminded me. Maybe one final thing I wanted to say was that's very interesting you said that, because also the thing that just occurred to me is that there's a whole kind of 15 minutes of the movie where it suddenly becomes obsessed with his breakup with his girlfriend.
Yeah.
And sort of turns into some other movie for a bit. Well, not in another movie, but certainly is less interested in the kind of animation relationship as moments, the immediate reality. And there's just really... I just remembered this conversation where the father is speaking to the brother, and the brother is finding out on the phone that Owen's I've forgotten
Emily.
the girlfriend Emily.
Yes.
Emily's broken up with him, and the father says this sounds like a brother conversation.
Yes, and there's real tension in the film at that point, isn't there? Because we see the brother sitting on the edge of the building, and he's
just looking out.
Yeah, and he looks. He's kind of in a precarious position, and and that does represent where he is in that moment. That he doesn't want this news. He's going to have to pick up with his brother, the emotional fallout, and then we get the filming of Owen. I think without the family framework, where there are moments where he's outside the building. He wants to wave to Emily. She wants to ignore him. So there's all of this difficulty that isn't negotiated via Disney, and I thought that was quite a good moment in the film, actually.
Yes, I know, actually, absolutely. But I think it might speak to some of the tensions we were about. What parts of Owen are they comfortable dealing with, and what parts are they not so comfortable dealing with?
Yeah.
Or indeed,
What
with
the parents, you mean?
The parents, us, the film.
Yeah.
I don't want to remove anyone from the equation, really, but it's certainly. Yeah, absolutely, and maybe the reason that bit of the film is quite striking is it feels quite different to the rest of the movie, because there's a different side of Owen being revealed in those moments.
Yeah, and it's quite, that moment is much more like the film, Rachel Israel's film Keep the Change. Do you know that?
No.
It isn't a film that has animation, but it's a film that is centred on an autistic character played by autistic actors in the film, the community of autistic people in New York, and the whole film is about those moments, and it's very funny, and it's kind of quite dark at times, but it absolutely gives you a range of sort of ways of thinking about and engaging with autism.
Okay, really interesting.
Well, I suppose that's also what the film this film made me think about autism, made me think about the experience of autism, the impact on a particular family, and also the learning about the sort of moving into sort of assisted living, and so I felt like that was really interesting, actually, the non-animated bits where they're kind of dealing with I guess and maybe that's why it ends on, there's a kind of a weird ending actually of the film. It ends with his triumphant speech, and then we get a bit of the Lion King. And I felt like they should be the other way around.
Right.
Why end on the bit of the Lion King where Pride Rock is saved and about to be turned into and bathed in sunlight again? You want to aim on him, end on him giving that speech. So I felt that sort of summed up maybe where the film's priorities were slightly askew, where it should have been the other way around. We end on Owen rather than end on Rafiki. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, we shan't end on Rafiki.
No.
But we will end shortly. But Janet, yes, so you mentioned your film at the beginning of the podcast. This people will be listening to this now, so by all means tell them what's happening with the film in the immediate future. But people might be listening to this years from now, so just give us a sense of what the film project is and where you hope people might be able to access it in the next few years.
Sure. So the film that I've just finished making is called Autism Plays Itself. It's a short film, 17 minutes, and it is based on sequences of an archive film that was shot in a clinic in the Maudsley Hospital in London in 1957, and it's one of the first mentions of autism that we could find in medical film, and it's a film that's half an hour long in its original form. It's full of medical intertitles and then very short sequences of children behaving, playing in this clinic, and it always seemed like a really dark, despairing, terrible film to me that I found difficult to watch. And we workshopped sequences of the film with autistic communities, along with other film extracts, trying to kind of get responses. What do people think of this? And at one point I thought this is just too difficult to show people, it's too disturbing potentially. But eventually, in the course of a project this long, I got to work with people over a long period of time, establish relationships. And I said to them, how do you feel about watching a film that's quite difficult? I gave them a description of it. Would you like to watch it in advance? How do you feel about responding to it in a podcast studio? So that's what we did. And none of them wanted to see it in advance. They wanted to be in the moment. So I had 3 people responding, Ash Lloyden, Ethan Lyons and Sophie Broadgate, who are all artists and writers, and recorded their responses. And then I edited it, created a paper edit, and then worked with Sasha Litvin-Saver, a colleague at Queen Mary, on how we would put this together. So it's a film that very much engages with the movement of the children in the film. So it's very much sort of stimmy, and it's short, looped repetitions of behaviour, and these are interpreted by the respondents, and they're really kind of like quite witty, quite incisive things that are said about these children that completely opened up the behaviour that we watch in this clinical context. And I think it's got a beautiful liveliness to it, where people are saying, look what that child's doing, and you kind of go, oh yeah, of course they're doing that. They're trying to work out, how that light works, or they want the sensation of stepping into water, and I think it really brings out the qualities of animation that are in an autistic apprehension of the world. That it's about touching and feeling and pushing things and doing things, and that experience of your whole body being animated in relation. And I think that that's such a different way of thinking about autism. And so I'm really, really happy that the project for me ended on that film, because it was just an autistic interpretation of the history of clinical views of autism that upends everything that's been said about it. So it's now being submitted to festivals. Great. It will eventually be on our website, the Autism Through Cinema website, and possibly, hopefully on YouTube and so on for longer.
And the website's, is it autismthroughcinema.org?
Yeah.
We'll link to that, yeah.
We'll absolutely link to that, yeah, absolutely. That sounds really exciting, and looking forward to seeing it. Right, yeah, talking of plugging, fantasy-animation.org is our website, where you can find the previous podcast episodes and blog entries.
Disney crops up a bit.
Disney crops up here and
just
there.
A little bit here and there.
If people listening who are research active are interested in any of the ideas we've presented, we'd love to hear some ideas for blog posts in the future. I think we touched on lots of interesting things there, but didn't do justice to all of them, because that's the nature of the podcast. So if anyone wants to get their teeth into it, that'd be really helpful to hear from you. You can follow us on social media, whatever it's called or however it exists, at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research, and you can use that same handle, FANANIM Research, to suggest, or at gmail.com to suggest episodes for our future footnote episodes.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Janet, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking us through an interesting movie, and a movie that highlights an even more interesting set of research and world that you've been working on the last few years. So it's been really delightful to hear about it.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
you.